Hello everyone and welcome to my Java tutorial series. In this particular episode I am going to be going over scope, method overloading, and the this command. Now to begin, scope is pretty simple. It's fairly explanatory. You've probably already run into this before, but I just want to clarify since it is an actual term. Scope is how variables can interact with each other and sort of where they're able to access in code. By this I mean, if I were to create a variable here in the class, I could access that variable bool anywhere in my program. Even if I were to create 13 if statements all nested inside of each other, I could still access bool. However, if I were to create bool inside of a method, I would not be able to access that, outside of that method like in the class. It's going to give me an error because it doesn't recognize that that bool exists. So if you're going to want to access something like that, you're going to need to make sure that it's in the class where you can access it through every method and in all the loops and stuff like that, because otherwise you're only going to be able to access it at that level or lower. The way, essentially the rule of thumb is wherever that method, or even if you're creating a class, if you're instantiating a class, you can only access that class variable from where it's created lower. Not necessarily in terms of the location of the actual thing. I mean, obviously I couldn't access, if I were to create, a Boolean here, I wouldn't be able to, set it to true up here. But it's more of sort of like the hierarchy. So if you create something, it also travels down below all layers too. Not just, height-wise of raw lines of code, but it travels through the layers. The brace is essentially of what I would be referring to as a layer. So, once you get inside of the method, you're inside of that layer of a method. If I were to create an if statement, which I will do for demonstration purposes, equals. Let me actually move this to inside of this method. Delete this. Right, so I can access bool inside of this if statement. Bool equals false. But what I could not do is actually create a new Boolean here because it's already seeing that I have a Boolean already. So it sees it already have a bool here. Right? So duplicate local variable. Okay. But what I can do is if I get if I do 2, I can create bool 2, but I won't be able to access bool 2 after I get outside of the if statement. Okay, so see, it's giving me an error now. Now, of course, this is the exact same thing that happens whenever you write a for statement. And I'll just write one real quick so you understand what I'm referring to. Right, we have byte I, and I'm just using byte because why not? Once that for loop is exited out, I could write another for loop that's using I, but I could not do this because I is already in existence, so I'd have to use a different variable. Okay, so it's sort of the same concept. You've already seen this before. Like I said, it's fairly simple. You've messed with this before. I just wanted to make people aware that that was a term, and it is useful to use. You want to try to avoid, if at all possible, declaring all of your variables at the beginning of a class, all of the variables that you would ever use. Put them instead inside of methods or inside of if statements or whatever, and try and declare them when you need them. And I know a lot of the time I would be breaking my own advice there because it's extremely handy to be able to just declare all of your variables at the beginning so you can see them all right there. And yes, it is very handy, but in some cases it would be better to save as far as memory usage and declare them when you need them. That way, once that line of code that is using those variables runs, you no longer have to have that memory being used by a variable that you don't need anymore throughout your program. Okay, so just on to the next thing, overloading. Now, you can actually have variables with the same name in multiple locations in even one class. Now, what I mean by that is not something like this. I wrote that backwards, didn't I? Let's just do an int instead. So we'll do test equals 500. I can't then go and do int test equals 600 because it's the same variable name and it's going to get confused and it's not going to work. But what I can do is stick that in here and then it's going to work. There's no errors, there's nothing. But what it's doing is it's sort of overloading the name, and I can access both of them by using the this command, which I'll show you in just a second. But this test is not the same as this test. This is its own test that's inside of the method. Now, of course, the reason for that is because the reason that Java allows you to do that, because Java is usually a language that goes out of its way to try to prevent you from making mistakes in code. I know a lot of people that did C++, have done C++. There's a lot of things that you can do that you can't do in Java simply because the language won't let you. But even if you did in C++, it would be wrong, but it doesn't show up as an error. So Java has a lot of ways of reducing errors like that, and this would kind of seem like, okay, why are you letting me write the same name twice? But Java knows that there's no way that you could access this test except in this method. So it's not going to become a problem because once you get outside of this method, you can't access that test, only this test. So it knows that this isn't going to be a problem and there's no way you could actually create a conflict with the name, so it allows you to do that. But maybe we want to access the other test. Maybe you want to use both. There's a lot of times in which you would want to use two variable names. You know, you have like an overarching variable name like name, but then you get like an input that's you would also call name. So you could do something. You can use the test, right? So I use this, and I can use this command, this dot test equals test. Now that seems very redundant, but it works. And what this does, if I type this dot and then the name of a variable that I have in my class, it will go to the highest possible variable. So this would, I believe, work in if statements. If you let me actually try that. I haven't tested it in like an if statement or something, but if I do, I don't know, bool equals true. Let's just create a quick boolean. Bool equals false or something like that. Right? Okay. So we do test equals new. Whoops. So we do this. Obviously it's not going to work because we have a test here. But we could do like that, right? We could set it to this test. So it would work inside of anything really, and it would go up. It goes up to the highest, sort of like the next highest section. The way it's referred to on the documentation is that it gets the object, the variable that's associated with the object, but just it would go up the next highest layer and look for that variable. But because we can't physically have a variable in the method and still have a variable test, because if we're inside the method, it's going to give us an error because we'll have two tests in memory at the same time. It goes up to the class. So it's always going to go to the class one. I was just test to make sure that was going to work correctly like I thought it was. So this is incredibly useful, and you can use that for methods too. which I know that would seem complicated of why you would want to use that for methods, but you can create multiple methods that are called the same thing, right? So if I do public void random method, and I just give this an argument of int input, it's not going to give me an error because it has a different argument than the one before it. So you can actually have multiple methods with the same name, sort of like you can have multiple constructors with the same name, right? It's the same concept as the constructors. You can have multiple methods and multiple constructors with the same name as long as they have different arguments. Because if you're creating an instantiation of a class, or if you're wanting to run a method, whatever argument you pass it will be what method it uses. So if I pass it an integer, it's going to use the second one. If I pass it nothing, it's going to use the first one. And if I add two arguments, if I have one with two ints that are called input and input 2, that would be its own separate thing. I could have one with a double and one with an int, and one with an int and one with a double in that order. And it would be two separate ones depending on the way that I put them. So you can do what it's called method overloading and do the same thing with variables. I mean, it's a little bit different technically than variables because it doesn't have anything to do with like memory and stuff. But you can use the this command with methods as well. I'll show you an example. Let me bring up one of these things here. Okay, so I know you're not going to know what any of this is, but I'm using this. I'm creating, this is a method that I'm running, and I'm passing it an argument, and I'm saying this. This is telling it to use the one that's in the class right now, right? It's I don't have to pass it any information. I simply say this, and it's going to use the one that's in the class right now, because this method is actually being created down. It's actually it's there. So add change listener there, and implements change listener, has some background code that adds that. But it's essentially it's sort of like an invisible method. I won't get into all of that right now, but you can use this as like arguments. You can use it, you could say this dot some method name if you want to refer to something in that regard. It's referencing something that you didn't want it to do. So this can not only be used for variables, but it can be used even as arguments and other such ways. You can use it however you need to use it. It'll just refer to, in this case, like I said, it's sort of referring to the method that's in this class. Since there's only one, it's just saying, okay, use the one that's in this class, not some other class, because I could pass it something else, but I'm just saying use the one that's in this class. And it's just an easy way that I don't have to write out an entire long argument. And with something like this, you could do int test equals 7, or just int test equals this dot test, right? And now it's just saying use the test that's up here to place it there. It's just always going to go up to the highest test. So that's sort of the way that this command works. And that, again, that can be applied to classes too. All of what I said can also be applied to classes. If I'm creating a class in a method, and I create a class in a, let me just run an example of this. Okay, so I could just do main equals new main. Is that not going to work? Alright, import it, that's fine. And if I do main equals new main, it's not going to give me an error because it's the same concept as a variable. It knows that I can't possibly use that class variable anywhere else except in that method, so it's not going to be a problem. And if I wanted to, I mean, you can't use the same concept of where you would set main equal to this.main. Well, I guess you could do the way that the addresses would work, but that would be a little bit more complicated. But you could still use this.main to access this one as opposed to this one, right? So you can use the same thing there. So that's sort of how scope works. I know it's not too much. Hopefully everything made sense. This, when used as an argument, I know can be a little bit confusing, like over here, whenever it's being used as an argument. So I know that can be a little confusing. I don't entirely fully understand how that works myself. I find it a little bit confusing at times, sometimes too, because like whenever you do that, sometimes you can actually refer to methods that you can't actually see and access, but it can this command can actually still access them anyway. So in some cases, you actually have to use this just to pass an argument to a method that you can't even see. So that can be somewhat confusing. But everything else I said hopefully should make some sense. If it didn't, let me know, how it didn't, and I can be happy to answer questions, or even remake a new tutorial with your thoughts in mind and possibly address the things that didn't make sense. But at any rate, feedback is of course always appreciated, and I'll see you all in another tutorial. Bye-bye.